Welcome back to episode 8 of the 0 to 3k IO score challenge. If you missed the last episode, then be sure to check it out because we got some really good Fort Week keys done since the affixes were pretty easy. And we are mostly doing 22s and 23s at this point, so we're super close on our way to 3k score. If you guys enjoy this video, then I would really appreciate it if you subscribed so you can see more of my content in the future. You can also check out my other socials in the description. It is time for another vault. I think we have 2 Mythic Plus slots on the Myth track. The big things that we're probably hoping for is a better DPS trinket on the Myth track. I think I'm going to open in Ret again because I think that would be a pretty big power spike for us. A Myth track shield would also be pretty good, but this does have speed, that's pretty good for Paladin. Or a Myth track chest might actually be the best thing we can get because that'll save us a ton of crests, and chest is also a very high budget spot for stats. So yeah, let's open it up. There is a chance that we get unlucky here and we have to take 2/3 of a socket, but we've basically been getting upgrades this whole series, so if that happens, it would be unfortunate, but not the end of the world. Okay, so we do see 2 pairs of legs here, which I could take for the possibility of switching out my embellishment. I don't really think I plan on that for this series, but if I do choose to play this character later on, maybe as Ret or Holy, that would be a consideration because I don't think you run this embellishment at all. But I'd have to check. I have no idea, to be honest. So yeah, this is pretty unfortunate. I could take the 2/3 of a socket. I definitely should have done a few raid bosses, but honestly, I don't think it's the end of the world. I think with our current gear, especially as it is, I think this is probably good enough to get us to 3k. I would prefer to be at maybe 480, but overall, I think our gear is pretty good. So I don't think this is the end of the world. Okay, so I think I am still gonna go with these Myth track pants. There's a pretty high likelihood that I don't ever use them for this series, but Myth track tier is pretty hard to pass up just for other specs. I did look and it seems like Ret are still using the same embellishment pants that I'm using right now, but you never know. I could run a different build eventually, maybe a lariat and the embellishment bracers for Prop Paladin. It's not very likely, probably not, but I think Myth track pants are still pretty good to take. Overall, pretty unlucky. Definitely should have done a raid slot, but overall, we're definitely running out of slots that could be upgrades. We actually have a good amount of tertiaries, which would probably make a potential upgrade hard to decide on, but oh well, probably a mistake for not getting a 3rd slot, but that's alright, I'm not too worried about it. We got a plus 23 Everbloom. 4 mythic dungeons for a piece of heroic loot. I also realized that we could catalyze a few of our items for better stats. Our stat priority is haste, then mastery, and then verse and crit are pretty equal. We catalyzed our belt, boots, and bracers, all for stats that I kind of prefer. And I think actually during this episode I did notice the difference with our items and having these better stats. Our first key was a plus 22 Dark Art Thicket. This key has been a bit easier as of late on Tyrannical, but it does depend on our healer a lot. I still haven't mastered dodging the Oakard breath, although one of you said to dodge left to right instead of trying to run away. So I think I'll give that a try. I'm just worried about hitting my teammates and maybe getting someone killed. Few things to make these pulls go faster after the first boss are to focus on the Dryad, and then you can take the Blossoms into the next pull, since they don't do much damage to your tank, and they do minimal mechanics for the rest of the group. They will get healed up by the Keepers, which is why if there is one in the pack you are fighting, you should 100% focus them down first and try to kill them ASAP. Oakheart was scary, but we got through it. One of our warriors ran through while the breath was going off, and there wasn't really anything I could do about this. Our evoker and other warrior died to melees, which was actually my fault. I pressed bubble here to be safe during the throw, since I had no other big CDs to use. I don't think this always happens when I bubble, but it does sometimes, so I'm assuming I need to taunt every time I bubble. I'm not sure if maybe that's a bug, or if that's intended, or maybe it only happens when you're in the throw mechanic if you bubble. I thought we were going to get a bit more score from this key, but we only actually got 2, and no gear sadly. Don't worry though, we will be getting plenty more score in this video. Next up was a quick one. So quick in fact that I actually forgot to record it until it was basically over. Luckily, there's not much that I actually missed. The trash in this rise went well, but we did have a pull where the melee stood a bit too close to the frontal, and once it came out, I tried to dodge them, but they still got hit. We tried again, and we just didn't really have the damage, and we started to run out of space before our healer died, and at that point, it was basically over. We had already wiped to this boss, I believe twice, so yeah, we called it GG and just joined another key. Don't worry though, as we will be getting plenty more score during the course of this video. The next key though was arguably worse. We had a pretty good group in terms of score and gear, but I made a mistake in this fall where my steed usage was pretty bad and the soak circle was really unlucky as it was super far away. So I just barely missed it since I had used my steed to try to get out of the circle debuff that's on the ground faster, and we didn't have any other melee who would usually be able to help out with this sort of thing. This was a pretty big throw from me, and it was pretty frustrating since this key on a plus 24 would have been huge for our week, since I was only really expecting to do a plus 23 at best. Although I do think Fall along with Atoll and Blackrook is probably on the easier side in terms of keys that you can push really high. But the problem with Fall on Tyrannical Week is obviously the second and third boss, which often cause a lot of pugs to fail before getting to the last boss. Our next key was a plus 23 Atoll Dazar on Tyrannical. This key had a similar problem to most of our other Tyrannical Atolls. It did give me a bit more practice as a little side note that I would recommend for all players that want to improve in WoW and Mythic Plus specifically is to try to consume as much high level content, where it be Raid or Mythic Plus, as possible. This week, for example, I watched every match of the first cup of the MDI, and the amount that you can learn by watching high level strats for 4 hours every day is insane. Obviously, I won't be able to do MDI style pulls in this series, and most of the groups didn't even run a prop paladin where they chose to actually take a vengeance demon hunter. Though that being said, you get reminded of lots of the really dangerous points in the keys and how high level players handle them. If you think about it, if a wipe is caused in the MDI from a certain ability being missed or maybe a mistake they made, you can 100% expect those same things to happen in pugs. So it is something that you can try to pick up on and keep in the back of your mind so that it hopefully doesn't happen in your own keys. With that being said, it is time for us to go to Razan first, where we then made our way to Priestess Alunza. Looking back, I definitely should have pulled this pull into the boss, as long as our group stacking is good, because this boss has lots of HP, and so your group doesn't actually do that much damage to her. The boss does the majority of the damage to herself, so it's mostly better to just get the fight started ASAP, so that she will start to do the abilities that take away a lot of her health a lot sooner. The rest of the key went really well until the last boss, which is where we hit a wall. We had 2 shots to make it in time, but our ads were dying pretty slow, especially as we got later on into the fight, and we eventually just split up too much and our ads were not stacked enough, so we had some deaths to that and a few deaths to spiders. We tried a few more times, but we had to call it quits, and in the end we weren't able to complete the key. I knew this week would be hard for depleting keys because we can't really have more than one wipe or mistake in these keys before it isn't possible to time them, and actually having a mistake on Tyrannical Week is arguably worse because the boss fights take so long. If you wipe when the boss is at 20%, the amount of time you lose compared to wiping on a fortified pole is a massive difference. Luckily, we had a few successful keys that were a huge score for us. First was a plus 23 throne. The priest was 100% aware of the big risk points of this dungeon on Tyrannical, which I totally agree with from my experience. The last boss really requires everyone to be soaking the ink, so luckily we actually had a group that was pretty coordinated for most of the key, and our DPS luckily carried us through the last boss. We mind soothed this pack since it wasn't needed for percent, so you can either mind soothe or invis here, but I think it is better in terms of the route since it allows you to deal with all the packs in the second boss room. Then we had a few deaths in the hallway from some mismanaged defensives during the elemental's swell ability, but I have gotten pretty good at trying to manage the stacks of the little corruption ads and pulling the big mob at a good time. You usually can have some struggles with it since it is based on the patrol, but the best way is to try to get the elemental mob all by themselves and just nuke it down as fast as possible. Finally, we got to the last boss, and one of you guys mentioned in a comment that putting the frontal on the other side of the boss than where the DPS players drop the puddle can help, and I do agree with this. Even still, this was a really close call, and by the end I was having to stand in the ink pools with defensives, and I was basically using all of my holy power just to keep myself alive. But it's kind of a slippery slope, as if you leave melee range, then the group will get one shot, and then it's basically a wipe. We killed the last boss with just over a minute left and 29 score. Looking back, we still had a minute, but this key felt really tight since there was basically no room for error, and if we wiped on the last boss, it was 100% going to be a deplete. We were almost at 2900 score, so we're getting really close to our goal. Back to another super fun key. We only had one death before the boss. We then sent Lust on the boss, but our Warlock's damage was actually really low enough that I was beating them on the overall damage. In our second intermission phase, we let 3 orbs go through and the healer just couldn't keep up. This caused a couple deaths, and with only 6% left on the boss, there was a shield that I basically had to solo, and by the time I got the shield down, it started another intermission phase, so I decided I would just wipe and try to start again. Our priest just logs out and it's basically GG. We can't do much but just join our next key. I joined a plus 23 fall. We had a few deaths to the first boss, but the real danger here is going to be the second and third boss. The first pull of the second boss, I got a bit distracted looking at my party frames, and I got a few stacks from the orb, which the healer said took away their focus, so it really shows that while this fight is basically zero responsibilities for the tank, your small mistakes can still definitely impact your group. We killed it on the next pull and made our way to the third boss, which was where we had some troubles that I don't think I've had happen in the series yet. This is probably the hardest dungeon boss in this key for healers in terms of straight up throughput. A tip for DPS and healers are that during the second phase, which in my opinion is the most dangerous, you want to be very purposeful when you are giving the tank the orb. Everybody in this group was giving me the orb basically as soon as they could right before the wins, but it lasts long enough that this means that I'm going to have to give it back to a DPS and then take it back in a few seconds so I don't get MC'd. This does a lot of damage to the DPS player, who will probably already be low health, who has to then trade it back last second. I tried to explain this, but in the end, we just didn't have the coordination and they kept giving it to me right away. So we couldn't get it done and the DH logged out after a few wipes. Next up was a plus 23 black rook hold. This key and a tall can make up for a lower rise, for example. We did the first pull very clean and then had a few deaths to sights on the first boss. But our damage wasn't out of the world, so I knew that it would come down to good kicks, stops, and defensives. I mentioned before that this part of the dungeon after the stairs can be a bit difficult because without comms, with my group, I can't stop every knife dance by myself. I can try my best to do as many kicks as I can, but also shoot RNG and which player gets targeted from the archers can really change how hard this pull is. So you basically need to just hope it's on higher HP players or that people will notice it and use their defensives. All of our deaths in this key were random deaths which allow you to save pulls and still recover, since one person can die and you can still easily finish the pull as they walk their way back. We killed the last boss with over 5 minutes remaining, got 26 score, and I also decided to re-roll my key where I got a plus 23 Waycrest Manor. Time for our last key. I wanted to try my best to get a Waycrest done, since it can be really hard on Tyrannical and Pugs, but if you guys do remember from the last Tyrannical Waycrest that we ran a few weeks ago, I had 2 disconnects which caused us to just barely miss the timer. So if we can get this 23 Waycrest done, it will be huge score that really should set us up for a good chance to get 3k next week. Basically, the first 2 bosses are very hard for healers and DPS players to stay alive, but I think we actually had a pretty good comp for this, and we managed to pull all the ads out of the courtyard and still had about 30 seconds on Lust, so I actually opted to do Ral first. I have absolutely no idea if that's how you say that boss's name, but oh well. I don't actually really enjoy this boss, to be honest, especially as a tank, since you're almost always slowed by the green puddles, so dodging the frontal is pretty annoying, and also it doesn't help that Prop Paladin's mobility is pretty bad. But it can also be hard to help with the servant ads, because if you turn your back or leave the boss out of melee range, then it's basically a wipe. We got to the Soulbound Goliath, and I tried to let my stacks get as high as possible, since I have my Paladin cheat and my Trinket cheat death available, so if I get one shot, I should be okay and should be able to recover. I tried to use my defensives well and spread them out as best as I could. I got all the way to 30 stacks on Tyrannical Week, which is actually pretty high, so that's pretty cool to see. We had a few deaths, but overall our healer did a really good job, and we used our defensives well enough. We just barely missed the 2 chest, which early on I didn't think was even going to be possible. We had a last second death that I believe was actually the difference for why we didn't get the 2 chest. So if it wasn't for that, we might have gotten it. We were 5 seconds behind, but it kind of is iffy, as I believe there's a little bit of leeway when you finish a key where you don't actually have to finish it directly at that time. I think if you finish a little bit after, like less than half a second or so, I think the game still gives it to you. It's only a difference of 1 score, so it really doesn't matter, but it actually would have been a pretty impressive achievement for this challenge. I asked for the ring that dropped here since nobody needed it, and maybe I could use it for another spec, or maybe I can also use it to move around my stats if I want to. I forgot to loot the chest here, and I actually got a cloak in the mail, but I don't plan on using it. Now that we are done with our weekly quest, we handed it in. We are really hoping for a heroic rage heart or golak, since it is actually our best weapon and we only have it on normal. We got the heroic tank trinket from council, which to be honest I probably won't be using at all. I also have a version on normal and I haven't been using it for plenty of weeks. One final thing I did for the week was for our last vault slot, I tried to do some heroic bosses, but most of the groups had 1 wipe and then lots of people would leave. So I just went with LFR and killed Tindril and Farak, since this now means that our vault will have 3 slots, so just in case we have to take a socket next week, we should be fine. Once again, we have reached the end of the week for me. This week had lots of depleted keys, so I do apologize for that. I know that it's not the most exciting content to watch, but I do try to keep this series as real and honest as possible. So if you guys did watch through it, I really appreciate it. We are now less than 50 score away from hitting 3K, so there's not much other to say than that. So I hope you guys enjoyed another episode of the 0 to 3K Radar.io score challenge, and I hope to see you guys next time.